In the late autumn of 1879, a faint lantern glowed against the darkness along a lonely road in rural Arkansas. To weary travelers, the light seemed like salvation. The forests were thick, the air heavy with mist, and wolves prowled the edges of farmland. Roads were long and punishing, and a safe bed for the night could mean the difference between survival and disaster. That lantern, hanging from the upper window of a two-story inn, promised warmth, bread, and a crackling fire. Yet for many, the glow of that light was the last thing they ever saw. The inn appeared ordinary by day. Its clapboard siding, slanted roof, and rocking chairs on the porch gave the impression of rustic comfort. A woman's voice might greet arrivals, welcoming them inside. Meals were offered, stables prepared, and rooms upstairs made ready. But in the surrounding towns and villages, stories began to spread. Travelers entered, but some never emerged again. Families searched in vain. Horses were found tethered in barns, wagons abandoned on the road, but the men, women, and children who owned them vanished into silence. Local newspapers began printing small notices: missing, peddler last seen at roadside inn, or farmer fails to return from journey west. The reports were scattered at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or the work of bandits in the countryside. But as the months passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. More and more names were added to the whispers: merchants, wanderers, young couples on their way to new lives. The road was dangerous, yes, but the inn itself gained a reputation that chilled even the most pragmatic souls. Some swore they had seen blood pooled between the floorboards of the dining hall, stains that reappeared even after scrubbing. Others claimed the woods carried sounds at night: muffled screams, hurried footsteps, and cries that faded into the trees. Children told of a woman's shadow moving along the upstairs hallway, even when the house was supposed to be empty. Skeptics blamed thieves and tricksters, while the devout insisted it was punishment for sins hidden in the town's past. But, to those who walked the road at night, one detail remained the same: the lantern in the window flickered, waiting, as if calling them inside. Travelers argued whether it was madness, greed, or something unholy that claimed the missing. Was the inn a trap designed by ruthless criminals who preyed on the desperate, or was it the stage for something that defied human reason? Diaries recovered from nearby families mention warnings written in trembling hands: "Do not stop at the house with the light." And so the question lingers: was this merely human cruelty concealed beneath the mask of hospitality, or did the inn become a vessel for something darker? A place where innocence met a fate no one dared fully describe? What began as an ordinary stop on the road became a legend, one that has outlived generations, its lantern still burning in memory, leading strangers not to safety, but into shadow. The inn did not stand in isolation. It belonged to the landscape of a fragile and half-forgotten settlement, a town whose identity was carved by hardship, superstition, and survival at the margins. To understand the inn's sinister reputation, one must first understand the world that surrounded it, for the town itself carried shadows long before the inn became infamous. Nestled in the wooded expanse of rural Arkansas, the settlement seemed both hidden from the world and exposed to it. Dense pine forests pressed in from every side, their dark canopy blotting out much of the sun. Fog drifted down from the hills and lingered on the road, often swallowing horse-drawn wagons whole. Travelers remarked that the town appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the mist, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings, leaning fences, and smoke curling from uneven chimneys. It was not a place anyone sought out, but rather a waypoint stumbled upon by accident. The soil was stubborn, often yielding little more than beans, corn, and a few hard fruits, and even these required back-breaking labor to coax from the ground. The townspeople lived in a perpetual state of want. Records from county ledgers and diaries of schoolteachers reveal families constantly on the brink of hunger. Malaria swept through in the damp summers, while influenza arrived with merciless regularity in the winters. The burial ground on the hill grew crowded with small wooden crosses, many without names, each marking lives that had ended too soon. Poverty was not merely an economic condition here, it was a climate, shaping how people thought, believed, and feared. And when people live under such pressure, they begin to search for reasons, explanations, and patterns, often beyond the reach of reason. Superstition seeped into daily life like the mist that hung low on the fields. The pine woods, for example, were said to be restless. Hunters spoke of hearing voices calling their names, only to return to camp and find no one had left the fire. There were rumors of lights floating through the trees, sometimes mistaken for lanterns, which led men astray into ravines. Children were warned never to wander near the swamp at dusk, for it was said a woman in white lingered there, her sobs luring the curious into the mud until they sank. Even illnesses were explained in terms of curses or restless spirits. When cattle sickened or crops failed, some claimed the land itself rejected the settlers, remembering older inhabitants who had been driven out or slain. It was within this atmosphere of fear and scarcity that the inn found its place. The building itself was unremarkable by daylight, a two-story wooden house, slightly crooked, its clapboards weathered gray. A small stable leaned against it, and beyond that stretched a rough garden where root vegetables clung to the soil. But by night, when its single lantern flickered in the upper window, it became a symbol, a question mark glowing in the darkness of the road. The paradox of the town was that its survival depended upon travelers, yet its fears were projected onto them. Strangers meant trade, fresh goods, tools, and news of the outside world. But strangers also meant risk, disease, deceit, or violence. Diaries mention how townsfolk gathered in the general store to debate whether newcomers could be trusted. Outsiders were welcome to spend money, but rarely welcomed into homes. Hospitality was guarded, often tinged with suspicion. And so the inn became the designated meeting point, a place where the town could benefit from visitors without fully embracing them. Yet this arrangement also turned the inn into a symbolic barrier, the first and last stop for many who passed through. Census records suggest the town never grew beyond a few dozen families, and this stasis bred claustrophobia. When lives are hemmed in by the same faces, the same rituals, and the same struggles, outsiders appear not only suspicious, but strangely powerful. Their disappearance, whether real or imagined, could be explained as the town's curse consuming them, or conversely, as the town protecting itself from dangerous intruders. Either way, the inn stood at the center of this psychological battlefield. Geography played its part in amplifying unease. The road that passed the inn was narrow and winding, bordered by pine stands and sudden ravines. Heavy rains washed out sections, forcing wagons to detour into mud-choked paths. Storms toppled trees that remained uncleared for weeks. To travel the road was to risk being swallowed by the wilderness itself, and thus, when people vanished, it was easy to believe the land had conspired in their disappearance. The inn's placement, right at the curve where fog gathered thickest, ensured it was always associated with danger and uncertainty. Oral testimonies from descendants of townsfolk reveal another layer, the belief that the inn absorbed the misfortunes of the community. Just as a sickly child might be labeled cursed, so too could a building become tainted. When fires swept through, barns or livestock died mysteriously, whispers circled back to the inn. "It draws darkness," one account recalled an elder saying. "It eats the luck of those who pass." This superstition meant that tragedies, be they murders, accidents, or simple disappearances, found a convenient scapegoat in the inn's walls. Psychologically, the town became a mirror of its environment. Isolated and insular, its residents projected their anxieties onto outsiders, while also fearing what lay within. The inn was both shield and threat. It kept strangers at the margins, yet reminded everyone of the dangers those margins held. Every missing traveler, every unexplained cry in the woods, reinforced the belief that the settlement existed on the edge of the natural and the supernatural. One diary kept by a minister's wife in the 1880s describes her unease at passing the inn while visiting parishioners. She noted a heaviness in the air, as though sorrow clung to its beams, and claimed she once saw a figure in the upstairs window when the house was supposedly empty. Another account, preserved in local folklore, describes floorboards inside the inn that never stayed clean, dark stains returning after every scrubbing, like the wood itself remembered what had been spilled. Whether these stories were true hardly mattered. In a community already primed for fear, the smallest oddity grew into a legend. But perhaps the most telling evidence of the town's fragile psyche was the way it narrated its own history. Generations of families passed down stories of curses, strange lights, and ghostly voices as though they were as real as tax records or weather almanacs. For many, these tales were not entertainment, but explanation, a framework to make sense of suffering. When illness took children, it was not only germs but also the land's punishment. When crops failed, it was not only poor soil but also a shadow upon the settlement. And when strangers vanished after visiting the inn, it was not chance, it was fate, fulfilling the town's dark inheritance. Thus, the inn became more than a building. It became a symbol of the town's collective identity. It embodied their contradictions, their reliance on outsiders and their mistrust of them, their craving for connection and their terror of vulnerability, their struggle to survive and their certainty of being cursed. Crime and legend thrived here because the soil of the community was already rich with fear, and the inn merely became the most visible vessel of that fear. What remains fascinating is not only what happened within the inn, but how the town itself prepared the ground for its legend. Poverty and isolation created pressure. Superstition gave shape to anxieties. Geography provided the setting. And human psychology, ever searching for meaning in chaos, turned coincidences and tragedies into stories. The inn, then, was not merely haunted by ghosts of the dead, but by the living fears of those who surrounded it. Even today, as the town has faded into obscurity and the inn itself has crumbled into little more than rotting beams, the legend persists. Descendants recall the whispers, while researchers note how collective trauma becomes enshrined in folklore. Old Black Hollow may be remembered as a site of disappearances, but its deeper legacy lies in how a community under strain forged meaning from shadows. And in those shadows, the inn still waits, part history, part myth, and wholly inseparable from the town that gave it life. The first whispers that would forever stain the reputation of the inn began not with a storm of blood, but with a single man's disappearance, a merchant named Samuel Price. In 1879, Price was known as a familiar figure across the Arkansas's backroads. He was not wealthy, but his wagon was dependable, filled with bolts of cloth, tinware, tobacco, and whatever small luxuries could be afforded by scattered farmsteads. Farmers' wives recalled his jovial manner, the way he could lighten the monotony of rural existence with tales from the road. Children anticipated his arrival because he sometimes carried sweets, peppermints wrapped in crinkling paper, or little wooden toys carved from scraps of pine. But in the spring of that year, Samuel Price's name passed from friendly memory into grim legend. His wagon was discovered abandoned on the muddy road just outside the town, tilted to one side where a wheel had sunk into the soft earth. The horse was gone, cut loose or fled, and Price himself was nowhere to be found. Inside the wagon, his wares remained undisturbed, as though he had stepped away mid-sale and never returned. Most chilling of all, his ledger, where he kept careful records of sales and debts, lay open on the bench, its ink smudged by rain. At first, townsfolk muttered about highwaymen. Banditry was not unknown in such isolated places, where law enforcement came more often by rumor than by presence. Yet doubts quickly spread. If robbers had struck, why leave the goods behind? Why abandon the wagon where it would be discovered, rather than loot it and burn it? And why did no one in the area hear gunfire, shouting, or the clamor of struggle? Questions multiplied, but answers dissolved into silence. Then came the second, more devastating blow. Later that summer, a family of 3 names recorded as Jonathan and Martha Green, and their young son, Elias, vanished along the same road. The Greens were small farmers from the northern part of the county, traveling south to seek new opportunities after a bad season left them in debt. Witnesses recalled seeing their modest wagon pass through town, stopping briefly for supplies. A stable hand at the inn remembered taking their horse, and another local swore he saw the family ascend the inn's front steps at dusk. After that, the Greens disappeared from history. No bodies were ever found, no wagon recovered, no trace save for a doll said to belong to Elias, later discovered in a ditch 5 miles from the inn. The disappearances, occurring so close together, electrified the community. Fear is contagious, and here it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind against a shutter, carried sinister weight. Women swore they heard crying on the road at night. Men returning late from hunts spoke of lantern light flickering in the inn's upstairs window, even when no one was supposed to be lodged there. A farmer's daughter claimed she saw a figure waving from behind the curtain, pale and gaunt, though whether living or ghostly she could not say. Others spoke of screams carried by the wind ragged, desperate cries that echoed through the pine forest before being swallowed by silence. The authorities, what few existed in that stretch of Arkansas, moved slowly. A sheriff from a neighboring county rode in, accompanied by 2 deputies, but their search proved inconclusive. They found no bloodstains, no clear evidence of violence, nothing to indicate murder or robbery. Officially, the disappearances were blamed on banditry and wilderness hazard. Perhaps the Greens were ambushed on the road after leaving the inn. Perhaps Samuel Price fell victim to illness or accident, his body carried off by wild animals. Such explanations satisfied paper reports, but not the people who lived under the inn's looming shadow. What unsettled them most was the pattern. Stories emerged that both Price and the Greens had vanished on moonless nights. Lanterns spotted on those evenings flickered oddly, as though the flame were caught in invisible gusts. Belongings turned up miles away, scattered deliberately as if someone had carried them far from the inn, not discarded in haste but placed like breadcrumbs in the wilderness. One hunter swore he found Price's pocketknife lodged in the bark of a tree 10 miles from the road, clean and glinting as though it had been set there deliberately. Another farmer found a child's blanket, possibly Elias Green's, half buried near his pasture. These fragments gave rise to chilling speculation. Someone, or something, wanted to confuse the searchers, to disorient them, to ensure no trail could ever be followed. The town grew restless. Meetings were held in the church, where men argued heatedly about whether to demand the inn be shuttered. Some insisted it was nothing more than coincidence, that accidents had been wrapped in hysteria. Others, more fearful, believed the inn had become cursed ground, feeding on strangers. Mothers clutched their children tighter when wagons rattled past. Travelers, once greeted with cautious curiosity, were now treated with suspicion, sometimes even hostility, as if the very act of passing through risked drawing more misfortune. Folklore flourished in the absence of fact. One tale claimed the inn was built on land once sacred to displaced native tribes, and that restless spirits demanded sacrifice. Another whispered that the innkeeper, whose name appears in some county records as Elias Burrows, was a practitioner of dark rites, luring travelers as offerings. Skeptics pointed out no proof existed of Burrows' guilt, and indeed, the man himself vanished from records after the early 1880s. Some claimed he fled the accusations. Others suggested he became the inn's final victim. Either way, his name became inseparable from the shadowed legend. Psychologically, the effect on the town was profound. When facts cannot be trusted, memory bends under the weight of fear. Testimonies began to blur. One woman swore she saw 3 strangers enter the inn the same week as the Green family, yet no evidence supports her claim. Another insisted Samuel Price had stopped at her farm the morning after he supposedly vanished. Such contradictions are common in communities strained by terror, where the line between perception and imagination collapses. People see what they fear to see, or what others expect them to see. Truth becomes impossible to extract. Still, the disappearances could not be ignored. They marked the beginning of the inn's descent into infamy, transforming it from a way station into a symbol of dread. Innocence, the simple desire of travelers seeking food and rest, met with something merciless and unseen. Was it calculated human malice? A series of cunningly staged crimes designed to sow fear? Or was it something beyond human comprehension, a force that wove itself into the timber of the house and the soil beneath it? The legend of the inn that never welcomed strangers twice was born from these first victims. Their absence became more powerful than any presence. For in disappearance lies the deepest terror, not the spectacle of death, but the void where life once was, leaving only echoes, fragments, and unanswered questions. And so Samuel Price, the Green family, and all who followed them passed from flesh into myth, their fates preserved not by stone markers or graves, but by whispers in the night, passed down from generation to generation. Even now, more than a century later, their names carry weight. Folklorists write of them, historians speculate, ghost hunters claim to sense their presence in the ruins. But for those who lived in that town, they were not abstract mysteries, they were neighbors, faces at the market, voices in conversation. Their loss was real, tangible, and devastating. And that, perhaps, is what made the legend endure, the collision of intimate grief with unfathomable uncertainty. The first victims gave the inn its reputation, but it was the town's fear, suspicion, and desperate search for meaning that gave the legend life. Together, they wove a tale that could never be untangled, half history, half nightmare, wholly unforgettable. The disappearances at the inn could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. By the early 1880s, the growing weight of fear and rumor spread beyond the confines of the small Arkansas settlement. Neighboring towns, alarmed by stories of vanished travelers and echoing cries in the forest, began sending investigators, men of authority, trained in law, medicine, or the church, each determined to uncover the truth. Yet the truth, when they reached for it, dissolved between their fingers, leaving only deeper uncertainty. The first arrivals were local lawmen and deputies, hardened by frontier hardships and accustomed to violence. They came expecting to uncover human malice, a band of highwaymen perhaps, or a cruel innkeeper running a hidden scheme. Their approach was methodical, pragmatic, and skeptical. They searched the inn's walls for hidden panels, the floorboards for trapdoors, and the cellars for evidence of bodies. By lantern light, they tapped at beams and plaster, listening for hollows. Some swore they discovered seams in the wall that suggested secret chambers, yet nothing tangible was revealed. A few reported odd scorch marks on the upper floorboards, shapes that seemed almost like crude symbols burned into the wood. One deputy believed they were remnants of firewood stacked carelessly near the hearth. Another insisted they resembled ritual markings, placed deliberately. Neither explanation gained ground, for the marks themselves seemed to shift with retelling, sometimes faint, sometimes vivid, always resisting certainty. The innkeeper at the time records are unclear whether it was still Elias Burroughs or a later tenant insisted on his innocence. He offered rooms freely to investigators, even joining their late-night vigils in the parlor. Yet unease followed him. Guests noted the way his eyes darted toward the stairs whenever the floor creaked above, the nervous tremor in his hand when serving supper. Was it guilt? Or fear of the very building he inhabited? The lawmen debated among themselves, but no arrest was made. Without bodies, without witnesses, and without confessions, the law could do little but observe. Where law faltered, clergy stepped forward. Word of the inn's reputation reached church leaders, and with it, whispers that the ground itself was cursed. A traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Albright became the first to mount a public spiritual intervention. He arrived with a small following, Bible in hand, and declared the inn a den of unholy shadows. Before gathered townsfolk, he anointed the doors with oil, chanting prayers of deliverance. At night he led processions around the building, singing hymns into the darkness. Locals recalled how the wind seemed to die when he prayed, and how strange knocks echoed from the walls during his sermons. Some claimed the Reverend drove away a malignant presence, if only briefly. Others mocked him, saying the only spirits disturbed were those bottled in whiskey at the tavern. Yet the clergy persisted. Over the next decade, priests and preachers returned to the inn in cycles, performing blessings, exorcisms, and purification rites. Holy water was sprinkled across its thresholds, crucifixes nailed above doorways. Each ritual seemed to bring temporary calm, yet the disappearances never fully ceased. For every prayer, there remained a whisper. For every hymn, an echo of footsteps pacing unseen. The persistence of mystery eroded faith as much as it challenged reason. Doctors and men of science brought another approach. From Little Rock and Memphis came physicians curious about the reports of paralysis suffered by guests at the inn. Survivors, few though they were, spoke of waking in the night, unable to move, as though pinned by an invisible weight. They described hearing footsteps near their beds, whispers too faint to decipher, the sensation of hands brushing against their skin. Doctors labeled these accounts sleep paralysis, a phenomenon in which the body lingers between dreaming and waking, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Such an explanation comforted some, but disturbed others. If the mind could conjure such horrors on its own, what did that say about the fragility of reason? Psychologists, though the discipline was still in its infancy, suggested contagion of fear. One man's story could inspire another's, shaping memory and perception until the line between personal experience and communal myth blurred. They cited examples from Europe, where villages once reported witchcraft, only for scholars centuries later to dismiss them as hysteria. Perhaps, they argued, the inn was no different. But skeptics of this theory pointed out one troubling fact: hysteria could not explain the vanishings themselves. Fear may twist memory, but it does not erase wagons, scatter belongings, or consume entire families. And still, the phenomena persisted. Cold spots chilled even hardened deputies as they searched the inn. Doors locked from the inside with no key in sight. Visitors awoke to find scratches on their arms, though no animal had entered the rooms. Reports described sudden drops in temperature, the feeling of being watched, and sounds like dragging chains across the floor. For every rational attempt at explanation drafts, poor carpentry, tricks of the mind, there remained an element that resisted logic. It was this clash between the language of science and the authority of faith that defined the inn's reputation. Each side failed in turn. The law could not prosecute shadows. The church could not banish what refused to be named. Medicine could not soothe terror that left physical traces. Together, their failures created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured legend. The townsfolk, caught between these conflicting authorities, lived in limbo. At Sunday sermons, they nodded when preachers spoke of sin and curses. At town meetings, they listened when doctors cited hallucinations and nerves. Yet in their homes, behind closed shutters, they whispered stories of ghostly riders, of travelers swallowed by the inn's hungry walls. Belief was not a choice, but a survival mechanism, shifting according to circumstance. Newspapers added fuel to the fire. Local gazettes reported each disappearance with sensational language, sometimes citing phantom lights or echoes of the damned. Editors favored mystery over certainty, for mystery sold papers. Scholars decades later would criticize this practice, noting how easily exaggeration fed this cycle of fear. Yet in the moment, those headlines carved the inn's reputation into public consciousness. It was no longer just a place of tragedy, it was a stage where the eternal battle of science versus superstition played out in real time. Perhaps most haunting was the realization that both sides, rationalists and believers alike, failed to bring peace. Families of the missing remained without closure. Communities remained divided. Travelers continued to avoid the road, or else entered the inn and were never seen again. Each failure deepened the inn's legend, for when neither science nor superstition can claim victory, mystery itself becomes the only truth. In the end, the inn became less a building than a symbol. To some, it represented the failure of reason in the face of the unknown. To others, it embodied the persistence of evil, resistant to prayer and ritual alike. For all, it was a reminder that the world is not as simple as law, medicine, or theology would have us believe. And so the debate endured. Was the inn a crime scene or a cursed site? Were the vanishings the work of human malice or supernatural hunger? Science demanded proof, but proof dissolved in shadow. Faith demanded belief, but belief faltered before recurring tragedy. Between these poles, the inn stood silent, its lantern glowing faintly in the window, a beacon that promised shelter and delivered fear. Even now, more than a century later, the clash of science and superstition echoes in the ruins. Paranormal investigators bring electromagnetic readers, while priests carry rosaries. Psychologists cite trauma, while ghost hunters cite restless spirits. And still, the inn offers no answers, only the same silence that swallowed Samuel Price, the Green family, and countless others. The mystery of the inn gained much of its power not only from the silence of those who vanished, but also from the broken words of those few who claimed to have walked out alive. These individuals were rare, scattered across decades, yet their stories formed a backbone of testimony that ensured the inn's reputation spread far beyond its valley. Each survivor told a story that was fragmented, contradictory, and at times unbelievable, but their voices carried a weight that rumor alone could never match. Unlike the missing, whose absence left only speculation, these survivors offered detail, too much detail, some said, for their accounts to be dismissed entirely. If the inn was indeed a predator, then these were the ones who had escaped its maw, staggering back into daylight with their sanity shaken and their lives forever altered. The earliest of these accounts came from Thomas Brigham, a farmer of modest means who spent his life working the soil and selling grain to nearby markets. Brigham was known among his neighbors for his seriousness, for speaking little, and for never indulging in wild stories. He was the kind of man who built his reputation on plain honesty, which made his later silence about the inn all the more chilling. For years after his single night there, he refused to discuss what had happened. Only in old age, while speaking privately to his nephew, did he reveal what had kept him awake for decades. He said that sometime after midnight he awoke with a heavy sensation pressing down on him. The room was still, the air strangely thick, and when he tried to move, he felt as if the very darkness had weight. He thought at first that he was dreaming, until he realized he was fully awake. Then he saw them. Not people, not shapes exactly, but darker outlines moving within the dark, shadows deeper than shadow. They circled the bed in silence, yet he heard his name whispered, once, then again, in overlapping voices. He closed his eyes in terror, only for the voices to grow louder. When he forced them open again, the whispers ceased, though the figures still loomed. He understood that whether his eyes were open or closed, he was not alone. By dawn, he fled so quickly he left behind his breakfast, his cart, even the coins on the knitstand. Those belongings were later found, untouched, but Brigham never returned to collect them. For the rest of his life, he avoided that road entirely. To those who knew him, his trembling hands whenever the inn was mentioned were proof enough that something unnatural had taken place. Years later, another account surfaced, this time from a seamstress named Margaret Ellis. Unlike Brigham, Ellis had no fear of speaking about what she saw. If anything, she seemed determined to preserve her experience as evidence that the inn was not just a place of disappearance, but of strange design. She described entering her upstairs room and noticing carvings etched into the wooden beams above her bed. The marks were unlike letters but carried a sense of deliberate pattern, curling in loops and jagged strokes resembling flames or roots. When she traced them with her fingers, she swore they felt freshly cut, the wood still sharp and raw. Disturbed, she went downstairs to ask the innkeeper about the carvings. He only smiled thinly and told her that no rooms in the house bore such markings. Insisting she was mistaken, he encouraged her to rest. When she returned, the carvings remained exactly as she had first seen them. But when she woke at dawn, the beams were clean, polished, and utterly smooth, as if no blade had ever touched them. Ellis, who carried a habit of keeping a travel diary, immediately sketched the symbols she remembered. Those sketches still exist in local archives, and over the years they have inspired endless interpretations. Some scholars saw alchemical symbols for transformation. Others claimed they resembled protective sigils meant to ward off evil, while still others dismissed them as meaningless doodles of a woman who craved attention. But to Ellis herself, the carvings were proof that the inn was a place with memory, capable of showing and then erasing its own secrets. The most disturbing account came from a widow named Eliza Warren. She had been traveling with her young daughter on a stormy evening when she stopped at the inn for shelter. Exhausted and wet, she remembered sharing a meal and taking the small room where she and the child curled up together in bed. The night was restless, but she eventually fell asleep. When she woke, however, everything had changed. She was no longer in the room, no longer in the inn at all. Instead, she lay in a muddy field miles away, barefoot, her clothes torn and soaked in morning dew. Her daughter was gone. No belongings, no sign of struggle, nothing but herself trembling in confusion. A woodcutter found her hours later and brought her back to safety. But when a search party combed the area and questioned the innkeeper, nothing of her child could be found. The innkeeper insisted she had checked in alone, and the logbook bore only her name. Relatives later confirmed she had set out by herself. Yet Eliza swore until her death that her daughter had been with her. The contradiction was unbearable. Had she imagined the child? Had grief warped her memory so completely that she invented a phantom companion? Or had the inn itself stolen not only her child, but the very evidence of her existence? Eliza became a recluse, her neighbors whispering that madness had consumed her. Yet others said her hollow eyes and trembling voice told a different story. She had witnessed what the inn could do to love itself, unraveling it until nothing remained. What tied these stories together was their inconsistency. Brigham spoke of shadows whispering his name. Ellis spoke of symbols that appeared and vanished. Eliza spoke of waking in a different world with her child erased. None of their accounts aligned. For skeptics, this was the clearest evidence that their stories were false or imagined. Human memory is malleable, and fear bends perception. But for believers, the contradictions were themselves the truth. The inn, they argued, did not reveal the same face to every guest. Instead, it tailored its horrors to each person's mind. Attacking their vulnerabilities, to the weary farmer, it whispered his name. To the curious seamstress, it carved its symbols. To the grieving widow, it consumed her daughter. Each testimony, though unique, was a fragment of the larger whole, like shards of a shattered mirror that could never be reassembled. Doctors of the time offered rational diagnoses. They claimed the survivors had suffered from nocturnal delirium, a state where exhaustion and fear combined to create vivid hallucinations. Brigham had dreamed the whispers. Ellis had projected symbols onto shadows of wood grain. Eliza had perhaps wandered in her sleep, lost in storm and grief. But such explanations faltered against the physical details. Brigham's abandoned cart, Ellis's sketches, Eliza's bare and bruised feet found miles away. Hallucinations did not scatter wagons or transport sleepers across fields. Unless, of course, the survivors exaggerated these details after the fact, reshaping memory to give their fear substance. Another theory pointed to mass suggestion. By the time many of these accounts surfaced, the inn already carried its reputation as cursed. Travelers arrived half expecting something unnatural. Every creak of wood, every flicker of candle, every gust of wind became proof that the legends were true. Fear itself could create the haunting. Yet for many, the survivors' voices carried too much sincerity to be dismissed. Their trembling hands, their haunted expressions, their reluctance to revisit the subject all suggested that whether supernatural or psychological, their experiences were real to them. And it was their stories, not the official records of missing persons, that fueled the folklore of the inn. Children told each other Brigham's tale while daring one another to sleep in barns. Traveling women stitched protective designs inspired by Ellis's symbols into their garments. Widows whispered Eliza's name when warning their daughters never to approach the valley. Through these retellings, the survivors' fragmented voices grew louder than any rational dismissal, embedding themselves into the cultural memory of the region. What is most chilling is how quickly their accounts transcended mere personal experience. Each survivor seemed to carry not just their own memory, but the memory of the inn itself. They spoke as though they had glimpsed something ancient and shifting, something that chose how much of itself to reveal before pushing them back into the world. They were not merely witnesses. They were unwilling participants in a larger story the inn itself was telling. And though their testimonies conflicted in detail, they agreed in one unshakable way: the inn was never just a building. It was an active force, capable of erasing, inventing, and twisting reality until truth itself became unreliable. Survivors walked away alive, but none ever walked away whole. As the decades turned, the inn's legacy ceased to belong solely to the families of the missing or the survivors who carried haunted memories in their trembling voices. It began to belong to everyone. Newspapers, travelers, and eventually folklorists and academics turned the inn into a mirror of their own fears, projecting onto it theories as varied as they were unsettling. By the turn of the century, the inn that never welcomed strangers twice was no longer a mere building. It had become a story, a symbol, and a riddle that refused to die. Theories multiplied like weeds after rain, each one attempting to explain the unexplainable, yet each one falling short, leaving space for the next generation to invent more. What followed was less an answer than a kaleidoscope of possibilities, rational, supernatural, and everything in between. One of the most persistent rational explanations centered on organized crime. Historians pointed out that the 1870s and 1880s were years of rampant lawlessness in rural Arkansas. Bandits preyed on isolated travelers, and corrupt sheriffs often looked the other way. To such historians, the inn was nothing more than a trap disguised as a sanctuary. Its reputation for hospitality was a mask for calculated robbery. Guests with valuables, merchants, farmers with cash from market, or families carrying dowries were targeted, quietly murdered, and buried in hidden pits across the property. The scattered belongings that sometimes surfaced miles away were explained as deliberate misdirection, intended to make investigators believe highwaymen had struck elsewhere. In this telling, the innkeepers were not passive witnesses to mystery, but active predators, masterminds of a crime ring that vanished into the landscape once suspicion grew too strong. Yet if this were true, one question lingered: why were no bodies ever found? A second explanation leaned on the darker realities of disease and environment. In rural settlements of that era, outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and pneumonia were common, claiming lives swiftly and mercilessly. Some suggested that travelers who fell ill within the inn's walls were discreetly buried to prevent panic or scandal. Others posited that toxic mold, carbon monoxide from poorly ventilated fireplaces, or even contaminated water could have caused hallucinations, delirium, and sudden death. These explanations framed the inn as a site of tragic coincidence rather than malevolence, a place where poor infrastructure and bad luck converged. Yet for those who believed in such natural causes, the testimonies of survivors proved troubling. Mold might distort memory, but it could not explain footprints vanishing into thin air or a mother waking barefoot in a field miles away. Disease might take lives, but it did not carve symbols into beams that disappeared by dawn. Science soothed but did not satisfy. Psychologists in later decades approached the inn as a case study in mass hysteria and memory distortion. They argued that fear is contagious, spreading through a community like fire through dry grass. A single disappearance, amplified by rumor, could cause ordinary travelers to interpret every creak, draft, and shadow as supernatural threat. Survivors, so the psychologists said, were not liars but victims of their own terrified minds, their memories reshaped by expectation and suggestion. The farmer who heard whispers had likely been dreaming in a half-waking state of sleep paralysis. The seamstress who saw carvings might have misinterpreted wood grain under flickering candlelight. The widow who lost her child may have suffered a psychotic break born from grief and isolation. Each story, therefore, became less about what the inn was and more about what the human mind could do when confronted with dread. In this interpretation, the inn was never haunted. It was the human imagination that proved haunted beyond measure. Yet here again, doubt persisted. Could entire communities, over multiple generations, hallucinate so consistently that their stories aligned into a legend too cohesive to dismiss? Folklorists, by contrast, leaned eagerly into supernatural interpretations, treating the inn not as a crime scene or medical case, but as a site of myth. To them, it was a liminal place, a threshold where the boundaries between the living and the dead thinned. Some described it as a hungry house, a structure that fed not on food or money, but on fear and flesh. In their retellings, the inn was less a building than a predator, luring in the vulnerable, devouring them, and spitting out fragments of story to feed its legend. The survivors, then, were not lucky but chosen, released to spread fear further afield. Others suggested the inn sat atop cursed ground, perhaps near an unmarked graveyard or the site of forgotten violence. Native burial lands were often invoked, sometimes respectfully, sometimes ignorantly, as a way of explaining the inn's appetite. Whether house or land, the folklorists agreed on one thing: the inn was not passive. It wanted, and what it wanted was never fully known. Religious interpretations added another layer, framing the inn as a battleground between good and evil. Ministers declared it a place where the devil himself had taken residence, pointing to survivor testimonies of whispers, paralysis, and vanishing children as evidence of demonic activity. Some communities performed blessings, exorcisms, and rituals on the site, attempting to banish whatever force lingered within. Parish records describe prayers chanted in the ruined rooms, candles burning through the night, and crosses nailed to beams. Yet each ritual ended the same way, with silence, unease, and no resolution. The inn remained untouched, indifferent to holy words. For many believers, this persistence confirmed that the inn was more than haunted. It was consecrated to darkness, an altar where innocence was the only sacrifice. To them, the vanished guests were not victims of crime or accident, but offerings consumed by something far older than Christianity itself. Modern paranormal investigators expanded on these religious ideas, proposing the inn as a site of interdimensional activity. To them, the disappearances were not murders but crossings, humans slipping through thin spots in reality, into places from which they could not return. They pointed to the survivors who described waking outside the inn, miles away, barefoot and confused, as partial crossings, people who had stumbled to the edge of the veil but been rejected. Theories of portals, time slips, and parallel worlds grew popular in paranormal circles, transforming the inn into a nexus point where physics itself failed. Skeptics scoffed at such ideas, but believers insisted that only such extraordinary theories could explain the complete erasure of victims from history. After all, criminals leave trails, diseases leave bodies, and hysteria leaves communities. Only the impossible could account for the inn's perfect silence. What makes the inn's legend enduring is not just the variety of theories, but the way they reflect broader cultural fears. The organized crime theory speaks to the fear of strangers and betrayal cloaked in hospitality. The disease explanation reflects the dread of unseen killers within the body and home. Psychological theories reveal our terror at the fragility of memory and perception. Folklore and paranormal accounts highlight humanity's ancient fear of being consumed by forces beyond comprehension. Each theory, in its own way, is less about the inn and more about the people trying to explain it. The inn became a cultural mirror, reflecting not its own truth, but the anxieties of every generation that looked upon it. This tension between rational and supernatural, between fact and myth, is what ensured the mystery was never solved. For every historian insisting it was robbery, there was a folklorist sketching diagrams of ritual sacrifice. For every doctor citing sleep paralysis, there was a preacher warning of demons. The inn's power lay in its refusal to choose sides. It offered evidence enough to tempt both camps, but proof for neither. Bloodstains that never washed away. Carvings that vanished overnight. Survivors who contradicted themselves in the same breath. Belongings scattered with no explanation. Each fragment dangled like bait, ensuring that believers and skeptics alike could never rest. Even today, long after the inn itself collapsed into ruin, its myths survive in oral tradition, in local ghost tours, in late-night documentaries, and in whispered warnings passed between children. Some treat it as a cautionary tale about trust, safety, and the dangers of the open road. Others treat it as a sacred mystery, proof that there are still places in the world where the veil between what is real and what is imagined is too thin to hold. What unites them all is the recognition that the inn has become larger than itself. Whether crime scene, cursed ground, or interdimensional gateway, it has outlived its own wood and stone, persisting as a story that no rational theory can kill. And perhaps that is the inn's final trick. By refusing resolution, by leaving every theory incomplete, it ensures its own immortality. Theories will continue to rise and fall, myths will be reshaped, skeptics will dismiss, and believers will defend. But none will silence the whispers in the pine woods or erase the unease of passing, a lonely building lit by a single lantern in the dark. The inn that never welcomed strangers twice continues to welcome them in memory, in story, in speculation. And though no one enters its doors anymore, we are all, in some way, still its guests. The inn may have collapsed into the soil of Arkansas long ago, but its story endures with unnerving vitality, as though the earth itself remembers what happened there. Travelers who once sought rest within its walls are now spoken of as phantoms, their lives reduced to cautionary tales passed down through generations. In small towns nearby, children still grow up hearing warnings never to linger too long by deserted crossroads or accept shelter from strangers who offer it too readily. The building is gone, but its shadow stretches long, shaping how locals perceive isolation, safety, and the fragile line between hospitality and danger. Every retelling breathes life into the legend again, ensuring the inn is never allowed to fade fully into obscurity. For some, the story belongs firmly to the realm of history, a tragic example of crime concealed by time and magnified through rumor. Historians point to missing persons records that align eerily with the years of the inn's operation, suggesting robbery or foul play as likely explanations. They frame the tale as a chilling reminder that human greed and cruelty often require no supernatural assistance. Yet even among scholars, the lack of hard evidence invites unease. The records raise as many questions as they answer, and the gaps in the narrative create fertile ground for mystery to bloom. Where bodies were never found, imagination fills the void. Where silence lingers in the archives, folklore begins to speak. Believers tell a different story. For them, the land itself is cursed, marked by rituals too dark to name. A place where the boundary between this world and the next thinned until it could no longer be repaired. They describe travelers waking to the sound of whispers, to lantern lights swaying in the trees where no hands held them, to sudden drops in temperature that made their bones ache. Some insist the inn was never fully a building at all, but a kind of trap and illusion spun to lure the weary into a space from which they could never return. These accounts, though unprovable, cling stubbornly to the imagination, capturing something deeper than logic can explain. The legacy of the inn endures not because its truth has been uncovered, but because its mystery refuses to die. It has become a mirror for the fears of every generation that encounters it. In the 19th century, it reflected anxieties about lawlessness on the frontier. In the 20th, it echoed cultural fascination with hauntings and curses. Today, it survives in online forums and local ghost tours, a living story that bends itself to fit the concerns of each new audience. The legend thrives not in spite of the unanswered questions, but because of them. Those who pass by the site today describe the silence as oppressive, the woods heavy with a presence that cannot be dismissed. Some claim to see flickers of lantern light through the trees, or to hear footsteps pacing just out of sight. Others report nothing more than a sudden chill, a primal instinct warning them to leave. Perhaps the inn's true horror lies not in what happened there, but in what it represents, the endless uncertainty of human memory, the dread of what waits in the dark when we are most vulnerable. Was it crime, curse, or something altogether beyond our comprehension? The ruins keep their secrets. The forest keeps its silence. And the legend waits, patient as ever, for the next traveler bold enough to believe it is only a story.